When the lawyer pressed play, my father spoke from the screen. But the words weren't his, and yet the voice was. I sat between my two brothers in a narrow office that smelled of paper and disinfectant. The video flickered to life. My father's face filled the monitor, calm, certain, and heartbreakingly familiar. He looked into the camera as if he could still see us. I, Harold Reeves, leave my entire estate to my eldest son, Andrew. My breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. Dad had never said those words, not in 75 years, not once in front of any of us. For as long as I could remember, he'd promised to divide everything equally. The lawyer's voice broke through the hum in my ears. The video was notarized 2 days before Mr. Reeves passed away. Andrew's eyes stayed on the floor. Evan stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. And me, I heard something no one else seemed to notice. At the very end, the audio stuttered, Dad's voice repeating softly, all, a glitch maybe, or a warning. Because my father used to say real love means sharing all of it. Now I couldn't tell what that word meant anymore. Was all everything he owned, or everyone he loved? Had my brother tricked us, or had Dad changed his mind? Maybe both. All I knew was that nothing on that screen felt real, and yet it was his voice. If your dad's final words left you nothing but doubt, would you fight for justice or for love? If your dad's final words left you with questions instead of peace, what would you do? I'd love to hear what you would choose: justice, forgiveness, or something in between. Tell me in the comments, because sometimes sharing the story is how we heal. My father, Harold Reeves, spent his last years by the lake in Ohio, a quiet man surrounded by old tools, notebooks, and the faint smell of sawdust that never left his hands. After Mom passed, he lived alone in the same wooden house they'd built together 40 years earlier. He used to say that place carried her laughter in the walls. He was 75, a retired engineer, too stubborn to slow down. When he learned his health was fading, he didn't call lawyers or bankers first. He bought a small camera, a ring light, and said he wanted to make things clear before the kids start guessing. 2 weeks later, he invited a local notary to record him reading his video will. Everything was official, legal, exactly how Dad liked things. He had 3 children, 3 very different versions of love. Andrew, 45, the eldest, sharp suit, confident smile, real estate broker with perfect hair and a nervous laugh. He once sold his own house to pay Dad's hospital bills. People said he was the responsible one, but I knew that kind of responsibility leaves scars you hide behind charm. After the market crash, he went broke. His wife left her job to care for their son. The debts never stopped calling. Evan, 41, the middle child, soft-spoken, a high school teacher who still graded papers on actual paper. He believed in rules, fairness, logic. He thought emotion only made things messy. He called Dad every Sunday, but hadn't visited much in the last few years. And then me, Clara. I'm 33. I work nights as a nurse assistant, sleep through daylight, and wake to silence. For 5 years, I was the only one close enough to hear Dad's coughs through the wall. We weren't perfect together. We argued about doctors, about vitamins, about his stubborn need to fix broken things himself. But every night before I left for my shift, he said the same thing. You're my anchor, kid. Don't let anyone pull you loose. Dad never liked paperwork. He believed words spoken with honesty were worth more than signatures. Still, he wanted no confusion after he was gone, so he recorded that video. He told me, half laughing, "This way, no one can twist my words." He'd said it in front of us once. Fair doesn't always mean equal, but it should feel right. We nodded, thinking we understood. Maybe we didn't. After the funeral, the 3 of us gathered in his living room. Andrew arrived in a black coat that looked too expensive for grief. He held a small flash drive between his fingers and said Dad wanted me to keep this safe. There were no papers, no printed will, no emails in Dad's old account. That alone felt strange. Dad always backed up everything. He even printed recipes twice. I asked, "Where did you find it?" He said, "In the safe with his old watch." His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. We met with Dad's lawyer the next morning. That was when the video played, the same one I've replayed in my mind ever since. Afterward, everyone left the office except me. I stayed staring at the frozen image of Dad's face on the screen. His mouth was caught mid-word. His eyes didn't move, as if something about him had been copied, not captured. That night I watched it again on my laptop. The sound was clean. Too clean. No hum from the room. No breath, no cough, just a flawless stream of speech. And then that last word, all. It didn't sound like him. It sounded like something made to sound like him. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I was tired. Maybe grief makes ghosts out of recordings. But the next morning, I replayed it again. The same cold perfection hit me. Dad had never sounded perfect a single day in his life. Evan came by to check on me. He sat on the porch sipping coffee from Dad's chipped mug. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "Maybe Andrew edited it. Maybe Dad changed his mind. But maybe—" He looked at me. "Maybe Dad wanted peace more than fairness." I didn't answer, because part of me wanted to believe that too. Maybe Dad did change his mind. Maybe I was just looking for a villain. Still, that word kept looping in my head. All, all, all. Would you question your brother if his proof looked perfect? That night I sat alone at the dining table, the house still smelling faintly of cedar and old varnish. Dad had built that table himself, every groove and scratch a story. The empty chair across from me felt heavier than anything I'd ever lifted. I turned on the small TV in the kitchen. A news anchor was talking about AI voice cloning scandals. Some politician's speech had been faked. Experts were warning about deepfake inheritance videos. The voice on the screen glitched for half a second, the tone flattening unnaturally. It shouldn't have meant anything. But my stomach turned. I muted the TV and stared at the flickering captions. Dad's face flashed in my mind, the way his voice sometimes broke mid-sentence, the way he refused to re-record even when his cough cut through. He'd once laughed and said, "If I start sounding perfect, you'll know I'm gone." That line haunted me now. I walked through the hallway, every photo frame tilting slightly from years of small earthquakes and careless hands. Andrew's graduation picture, Evan's wedding, Dad's fishing trip, all pieces of proof that time used to work in our favor. Now it only kept receipts. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of a passing train. For a second it sounded like his voice again, low, steady, unfinished. I still remember the day Dad decided to record his will. He didn't want anyone's help, not even mine. He set up the tripod by the window, adjusted the lamp from his workbench, and balanced the little camera on a stack of books. "If the paper burns," he told me, half smiling, "the camera keeps my promise." His hands trembled as he spoke. He hated being watched, even by a lens. He recorded the first take, stumbled on a few words, cursed softly, and started over. By the fifth attempt, he was sweating. He looked up at me, embarrassed. "Do I sound like I mean it?" he asked. I said, "You always do, Dad. You just don't need to sound perfect." He laughed at that, one of those small laughs that live longer in memory than in real life. The next morning, he asked me to help him test the microphone. When I plugged it in, a soft hiss filled the room. He nodded, satisfied. "Hear that static?" "That's truth," he said. "Real sound always crackles. When it doesn't, something's been cleaned too much." That sentence never left me. I can still picture him in his chair, the old coffee mug with Mom's name printed in fading gold beside him. He never replaced it even after it cracked. Every evening we sat by the window listening to the same radio channel he'd tuned since 1968. The news was dull, the music scratchy, but he said that noise was what made it feel alive. "Life doesn't sound perfect, Clara," he'd tell me. "If it does, it's lying to you." When his health worsened, I started working extra night shifts. We spoke less. The day he passed, I wasn't there. The hospital called while I was changing linens for a patient. They said he went quietly, but the last thing he'd told me before that night still echoes in my head. "Don't trust what sounds too perfect." For months, I carried that sentence like a bruise I couldn't cover. Every time I played the new video, I heard what was missing: the breath between words. The cough he always tried to hide, the faint ticking of the clock. All those imperfections were gone, replaced by a voice too smooth to be real. That's when I knew something wasn't right, because my father's truth had always come with a little noise. Would you still believe what's real if it sounded too perfect? I remember one afternoon when Dad asked me to help him record a message for Mom's memorial. He'd set up an old camera on the counter, trying to look serious, but his coffee mug was too close to the edge. Halfway through it, tipped, spilling everywhere. He froze for a second, then burst out laughing, a deep, broken laugh that filled the whole kitchen. "Now that's the truth," he said, wiping the floor with a towel. "They'll never deepfake this mess. We never reshot that take." He said the mistake made it real. That was Dad, always chasing honesty even when it looked like chaos. Back then I didn't understand. Now I'd give anything to hear that laugh again, unpolished human alive. The lawyer's office smelled like printer ink and old coffee. A heavy clock ticked behind him, cutting through every breath. We sat in the same seats as before, Andrew near the door, Evan across from me, and the flash drive lying between us like a bullet that hadn't been fired yet. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Reeves's digital will meets all state requirements," he said. "Video testimony with a verified notary signature is valid in Ohio." Valid. The word felt heavier than it should. Andrew leaned back, exhaling. Dad didn't want us fighting. He made this to keep things peaceful. He sounded tired, almost sincere. I wanted to believe him, but the more he spoke, the more rehearsed it felt, every pause in the right place, every sigh perfectly timed. Evan cleared his throat. "So, that's it then, there's no written copy?" The lawyer shook his head. He said he preferred to speak his intentions. "There's only this." He pressed play again. Dad's image filled the screen, flickering slightly under the fluorescent lights. "I, Harold Reeves, leave my entire estate to my eldest son, Andrew." The room fell silent, except for that ticking clock. I watched his eyes, calm, focused, unblinking. There was no tremor in his hands, no hesitation in his breath. That wasn't how my father spoke when he was weak. When the video ended, the lawyer nodded as if that were the closing of a case, not a life. Unless there's evidence of coercion or forgery, the distribution stands. Evidence. The word echoed through my head. I stared at the paused frame, the outline of my father frozen mid-blink. There was something sterile about him, something smoothed out, like someone had scrubbed the humanity away. Evan rubbed his temples. Clara, maybe Dad changed his mind after all. Andrew did a lot for him. I whispered, "He changed everything we believed for 40 years in a single sentence." Andrew looked at me for the first time. His eyes were glossy wet, but not from guilt, from exhaustion. "You weren't there every day when the bills came," he said quietly. "Dad and I talked about this. You have no idea how much he worried about you." I almost snapped back, but the words caught in my throat. Maybe he was right. Maybe Dad had confided in him, the son who'd bailed him out. But that voice in my gut wouldn't shut up. I asked for a copy of the file. The lawyer hesitated. "It's not common practice." "I'm not common practice," I said. He handed me a USB duplicate labeled Harold Reeves' Final Will, approved copy. As we left, Andrew's hand brushed my shoulder. "Don't do this, Clara," he said. Dad wanted peace. I looked up at him. Peace isn't the same as silence. That night, I drove home with the USB in my coat pocket. The road shimmered under sleet headlights bending in the rain. I kept hearing my father's voice in my head, looping that same phrase, "Real love means sharing all of it." But what if all now meant everything except me? At home, I couldn't sleep. The USB sat on the kitchen table next to Dad's old mug. Its handle was cracked, the gold letters nearly gone, M+H, 1979. But I still used it every morning. At 2 a.m., I finally opened the file. The screen flickered, and there he was again. Calm, steady, unreal. The same sentence rolled out like a sermon. "I, Harold Reeves, leave my entire estate to my eldest son, Andrew." I watched his mouth move. Something itched at the back of my brain. I slowed the video to half speed. That's when I saw it, his lips clearly forming the word equal, but the audio said entire. My stomach dropped. For a full minute I just stared, hoping I'd imagined it. Then I replayed the segment again and again until the silence between frames felt louder than his voice. Dad never pronounced words cleanly near the end. His dentures slipped a little, his breath dragged. But here, every syllable was crisp, symmetrical. It was too perfect. I remembered what he'd said, "Don't trust what sounds too perfect." By morning, my head throbbed from lack of sleep. I drove across town to see Mark, my ex, the audio engineer. We hadn't spoken since I'd left him for being emotionally unavailable, but Mark was the only person I trusted with sound. He opened the door in pajama pants, holding a mug labeled World's OKest Engineer. I told him everything. He didn't laugh. He just said, "Let's hear it." Inside, his studio monitors glowed like watchful eyes. He imported the file, zoomed in on the waveform, and pressed play. The sound that came out was eerily flat. No hiss, no air, no room tone. Mark frowned. "Where's the noise floor, the what I asked?" The tiny fuzz every microphone picks up. It's gone. Someone cleaned it or replaced it. He highlighted the last 3 seconds. See this line, the harmonics cut off right before all. That's synthetic. I stared at the screen, lines, blue spikes, a little scar right before Dad's final word. So, you're saying someone faked it? He hesitated. I'm saying part of it isn't him. Maybe an edit, maybe an AI patch. AI. The letters hit like a door slamming in my chest. Can you prove it? Not legally, but if you find the raw files, I can. I left his place shaking. The city looked different too, bright too sharp like reality itself had been filtered. I pulled over by the lake where Dad used to fish and played the audio again on my phone. Through the tiny speaker, the word all wavered, mechanical, almost metallic, like a machine trying to imitate affection. Evan called that afternoon. Mark told me you're chasing ghosts, he said. I'm chasing Dad's voice, I replied. He sighed. Maybe Dad recorded 2 versions. He could have wanted different outcomes, 2 versions of his truth. Maybe one for peace, one for fairness. Which do you think he'd pick? His calm tone made me angrier than shouting would have, because he sounded reasonable, and reason felt like betrayal. I replayed the video for him over the phone, holding the speaker close to the mic. When it reached the end, he was quiet. Then he said, Clara, grief makes us hear things. Maybe Dad really did want to leave it all to Andrew. No, I whispered. If we let this pass, Dad dies twice. That line came out before I could stop it. I hung up before he answered. The rest of the day blurred. I went through Dad's old emails, his external drives, his notebook full of passwords. Half of them were wrong or expired. The other half led nowhere. Still, I kept digging because once you hear a lie in someone's voice, every silence after it sounds guilty. By nightfall, I had played that clip over 50 times. Each repetition peeled away a piece of my certainty until only instinct remained. Something was wrong. And whoever had cleaned his voice had tried to erase more than static. They'd erased him. Would you risk your family to protect your father's truth? 2 weeks later, the forensic lab finally called. Their voice on the phone was calm, clinical. Too calm for what they were about to say. Ms. Reeves, our analysis confirms that portions of the recording were generated artificially. The final 8 words are synthesized using a voice cloning algorithm. 8 words. That was all it took to rewrite a life. I thanked them, hung up, and sat in my car with the report trembling in my hands. The pages were filled with phrases I barely understood: spectral dissonance, AI timbre replication, non-human harmonic decay. But the summary was plain English. The final segment does not match the original speaker. I drove straight to Andrew's house. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything smelled like cologne and printer paper. His laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, humming. I didn't mean to look. But grief gives you courage you shouldn't have. On the screen was a folder labeled Voice Tools. I clicked. Inside, software called Vocal Forge AI, the same type the report described. Next to it, a file name froze me in place. Final Cut A MP4. My hands shook as I pressed play. There it was again, the same clip, same words, but at the bottom corner, a timeline marker showed last modified 2 days after Dad's death. Clara. His voice came from behind me. I turned. Andrew stood in the doorway, hair messy, eyes sunken. He didn't look angry, just tired. I was going to delete that, he said softly. Then why didn't you? Because you wouldn't believe me anyway. He walked past me, shut the laptop, and leaned against the counter. Dad asked me to help clean the audio. He wanted it to sound professional. He hated how shaky his voice got. I swallowed. You edited his will? I fixed his tone, not his words. But you changed them, Andrew. He slammed his hand on the counter. He told me to. The sound echoed through the house like a gavel. He was ashamed he couldn't even speak clearly. He said, "Make it sound right, son." So I did. I stared at him, tears burning my eyes. You think that gave you permission to rewrite his truth? He looked away. I paid his debts, Clara. I kept him alive when you couldn't afford his meds. I'm the one who stayed. His voice cracked on that last word, stayed. And for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be holding Dad's hand in hospital hallways. Maybe he was right. Maybe Dad really had wanted to thank him to make things easier. But even if that were true, it wasn't justice. It was mercy twisted into ownership. Evan arrived later that evening after I called him. He listened to both sides, silent, patient, tired of being the referee. Finally, he said, maybe we all need to stop thinking Dad was perfect. Maybe he made promises he couldn't keep. Maybe we're the ones trying to make him sound better than he was. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. That night, I copied the forensic report, printed it, and placed it beside the mug Mom had given Dad. Then I turned on the video again. The glow of the screen lit up the empty living room. Dad's face looked so real, it hurt. I Harold Reeves leave my entire estate to my eldest son, Andrew. Then, right at the end, the glitch, a tiny skip before all. I closed my eyes and let the word loop in my head, all, until it stopped sounding like English. Somewhere between each echo, I realized what haunted me most. Not that Andrew lied, but that part of me wanted to forgive him, because forgiveness was easier than truth. I whispered into the dark, "You didn't deserve this, Dad." Then quieter, but maybe none of us did. When the video ended, I felt nothing. No relief, no closure, just silence too clean to be real. Would you protect the truth if it broke what's left of your family? The next morning, I drove 2 hours to the state forensic lab, the kind of place where truth wore a lab coat. The receptionist led me down a hallway lined with posters about digital integrity. Everything smelled like sanitizer and humming electricity. A technician named Miller met me in a glass room filled with monitors. He wore headphones around his neck, his voice dry but kind. "We've analyzed hundreds of fake testimonies this year," he said. "It's getting hard to tell what's real unless you zoom all the way into the waveform." He showed me Dad's clip on a wide monitor. The lines pulsed green and blue across the screen. "This is your father's real voice," he said, highlighting a section spikes uneven, natural. Then he pointed to the ending. "And this is machine clean. Notice the difference. No breath, no mic static. The AI smooths out life itself." I stared at the data shapes of a man I used to know. "Can you undo it?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "You can't unsmooth the truth. You just show people where it was ironed." That night I brought the report home. Andrew called. His voice shook. "Clara, please stop this. You're going to ruin everything Dad built." I said, "I'm not ruining it, Andrew. I'm just refusing to let it be edited." He hung up. Hours later, Evan called too. "Maybe it's time we talked." "All three of us," he said quietly. We met the next evening at Dad's house. The same kitchen where he taught us how to sand wood and share chores now smelled like dust and cold. Andrew sat at the head of the table, arms crossed. Evan brought coffee. No one drank it. I placed the lab report in the center. Dad's last 8 words were generated by an AI. I said. Andrew didn't move. "You forged a man who can't defend himself." He finally looked up. "I didn't forge him. I tried to help him say what he meant." "Then why did you replace his voice?" "Because he couldn't breathe without coughing." "Clara?" Andrew shouted. "Because he hated sounding weak." Evan slammed his hand down. "Stop it, both of you." He turned to Andrew. "Did Dad ask you to change it, or did you just assume he would have?" Andrew didn't answer. He just stared at the report, his thumb rubbing at a coffee stain on the table. Dad's stain still there after all these years. His voice cracked. "I just wanted him to sound proud. Just once." The room went quiet. Even the refrigerator stopped humming like it didn't want to interrupt. Evan whispered, "Then you should have let him sound human." Andrew covered his face with his hands. "I'm sorry," he said over and over like it could rewrite something, but words don't edit themselves back. When I left, I looked around the empty house one last time. The old clock ticked steadily, unbothered by the mess we'd made of meaning. The air felt heavy, full of ghosts that didn't speak but still made noise. For the first time, I understood what Dad meant when he said, "Real sound always crackles." It's not the noise that proves it's real, it's the imperfection that hurts. A few days later, the court requested one final review of all evidence before the hearing. I sat in the waiting room while the forensic technician, Mr. Miller, reviewed the files one last time. Through the glass wall, I watched his screen light up with sound waves, mountains and valleys of truth and imitation. He stepped out tired, but sure. "Ms. Reeves," he said, "I've seen hundreds of forged voices this year. Most sound almost perfect. Yours doesn't. That's how I know it's real." I frowned. What do you mean perfection's a red flag? He said. Real voices stumble. Later outside the courthouse, I met Andrew again. He was standing by Dad's old pickup truck, hands in his pockets, eyes red. I read the report, he said. I nodded. He took a long breath. I wanted to fix the audio for him. I thought it would make people take him seriously. I didn't mean to erase him. You didn't erase him, I said. You erased us, he winced. So what now? I looked at the courthouse door, its reflection trembling in a puddle of melted snow. Now we let him speak again, the way he did, cracked, coughing, alive. For once, Andrew didn't argue. He just nodded, whispering, I miss him too. When he left, I stayed a while longer, watching the puddle distort the courthouse lights. The ripples looked almost like sound waves, bending, warping, returning to stillness. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the truth waiting its turn. When they both left the courthouse, emptied around me. The noise of footsteps faded, replaced by the hollow hum of the ventilation system. I sat in the waiting area, still holding the report Miller had printed, paper proof of something that could never be unseen. A few minutes later, Miller walked out of his office. He had changed out of his lab coat, carrying a thermos that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. He looked surprised to see me still there. You stayed, he said. Couldn't leave, I admitted. Feels like if I move, the truth might shift again. He smiled faintly. You sound like my wife. She used to say facts don't matter if people don't want them. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees. I've spent 20 years listening to lies through headphones, he said. Campaign speeches, ransom calls, fake confessions. People forget that sound carries emotion, not just data. Machines can mimic the words, but they can't fake guilt. I looked at him, half smiling. Are you sure my brother seemed to manage both? Miller chuckled softly. That's not guilt, that's fear. Guilt vibrates differently. He tapped the side of his temple. It trembles here. He leaned back, watching the ceiling. You know, your father's file was one of the few I didn't need a computer to tell me was real. I could hear his pauses, tiny hesitations between words. They sounded like someone trying not to say goodbye too fast. His voice softened. He knew this would happen. I frowned. What do you mean? He looked at me carefully. In the metadata folder, there's a short voice memo your father recorded 2 days before the will. Just background noise, nothing legal. But he says, if they argue after I'm gone, maybe this recording will remind them what love sounds like. My throat tightened. Can I get a copy? He nodded. Already sent to your email. Use it however you need. Some things deserve to be heard, not archived. As I stood to leave, Miller added quietly, Miss Reeves, don't mistake proof for peace. They're not the same thing. Outside, the sun was low, turning the courthouse windows to gunk. I held the report tight against my chest. The paper rustled sharp, real, imperfect. In that sound, I heard my father again, coughing, laughing, saying the wrong words in the right way. Not perfect, not edited, just true. For the first time, the weight of the truth didn't feel like a burden. It felt like gravity, heavy, yes, but necessary to keep everything from floating away. And maybe it was time to stop chasing perfection and start protecting what's human in the noise. The house feels different at night now. It used to hum pipes ticking floorboards, breathing the slow rhythm of a place that's been lived in too long. Now it's just quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. I sit in Dad's old chair by the window, the one that groans when you lean too far. On the table, his coffee mug catches the yellow light, a tiny crack running down the handle like a scar. I press play on the original recording, the one Mark salvaged from his hard drive. The screen shows Dad sitting in the same chair, wearing the same flannel shirt I can still smell in the closet. The video flickers. And then that sound, soft static, the kind he loved. I'll divide my estate equally among my 3 children, he says. His voice shakes, catches on the word, equally. There's breath, a tiny cough, the ticking clock in the background. Every imperfection hits harder than perfection ever could. I close my eyes and feel the guilt roll in. Because I deleted his email, the one that might have held the truth. Because I left him alone that last night. Because even now, I'm still trying to make sense of a man who never wanted to be figured out. My phone buzzes. Evan again. He doesn't sound angry, just tired. Andrew hasn't left the house in days, he says. His wife's furious. The press might catch wind of this. I sigh. Let them. Maybe shame is the only thing that makes him tell the truth. Evan pauses. You think Dad would want that? The question lands harder than it should. Maybe he's right. Dad hated spectacle. He hated watching people tear each other apart for proof. I whisper, maybe Andrew changed the video, but maybe I changed something too by leaving him alone. Silence. Then Evan says, Clara, we all did what we thought was right. Maybe we just did it too late. He hangs up. I stay there long after the call ends, listening to the faint hiss from the speakers. The static fades in and out, like breathing. It feels alive. And somewhere between those little bursts of noise, I start to understand. Maybe Dad didn't mean all as a number. Maybe he meant it as a promise to share everything. Love, regret, memory, guilt, all of it. The next morning, I open my notebook and write 3 words across the page. Static means truth. The ink bleeds a little into the paper, imperfect like him. When Evan visits that afternoon, he looks lighter, almost at peace. He sits across from me and says quietly, Dad once told me truth isn't quiet, it just waits to be heard. I smile. Sounds like him. We play the recording together. For the first time, I don't flinch at the noise. I listen for it, the soft hiss, the cough, the clock, the little tremor in his laugh. That's where the life is. That's where he still is. When it ends, I don't replay it. I just sit with the silence that follows, realizing it isn't empty anymore. It's full of everything he left behind. If guilt could speak, would it sound like static or silence? Later that night, I opened my journal and began writing a letter I'd never send. The pen felt heavy, like it knew I was lying by pretending this was just for me. Dear Dad, I wrote, I don't know what hurts more, losing your voice or realizing I never really listened while you were here. You used to say truth doesn't shout, it hums. I think I finally hear it now. My handwriting slanted, the ink bleeding into the paper's grain. I wanted to be the good daughter, the one who stayed, who understood you. But maybe I stayed too long in my own noise. I thought love meant protecting you from change. I didn't see that you were already teaching me how to face it. I stopped, let the pen rest. The room was so still that I could hear my pulse echo off the window pane. I folded the page, slid it under Dad's old mug, the same chipped one he used every morning. For a moment it felt like he might reach for it again. Then I walked over to the shelf where his radio sat, the same one that had played the news every dawn. The antenna was bent, the dial stiff. I turned it slowly until the static filled the room, soft and uneven, his kind of truth. And then through the noise, a familiar song slipped out, thin but clear. Take Me Home, Country Roads. Dad used to hum that while fixing the porch steps, tapping his hammer to the beat. Now the tune wavered, drifting between stations as if traveling from somewhere far past the static. I closed my eyes and whispered along with it. Every note felt like forgiveness, quiet, imperfect, human. When the song faded, I didn't turn the radio off. I just let the static stay. It sounded more like home than silence ever did. A week after the report came back, I got a call from the courthouse technician. His voice was dry, matter-of-fact. Ms. Reeves, we've recovered a folder labeled Legacy Video from your father's drive. You might want to come in. I drove there with Evan. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of cold that bites through every layer. Neither of us spoke. Inside the evidence room, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The technician sat at a desk surrounded by cables and old hard drives. He nodded to a monitor. This file hasn't been modified. Timestamp predates the version you submitted. He pressed play. Dad appeared on the screen again, smaller, dimmer, but real. No studio clarity, no sterile silence, just him in his flannel shirt, sitting where the sunlight used to fall across the living room wall. I'll divide everything equally among Andrew, Evan, and Clara. His voice trembled. He coughed halfway through, then laughed softly, embarrassed. The old clock ticked behind him. Birds called outside. Every sound was human. For the first time since the funeral, I felt air fill my lungs properly. Evan's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Andrew sat in the corner, fists pressed to his knees, jaw tight. No one said a word until the video ended. The technician cleared his throat. Looks authentic. Full metadata chain intact. Andrew stood up abruptly. I need some air. He walked out before anyone could stop him. I followed him down the hallway. He leaned against the window at the end, staring out at nothing. His reflection looked older than I remembered, older than either of us should be. Maybe he changed it later, he said quietly. Maybe he wanted it that way. I shook my head. He never said those words, Andrew. You know that. He didn't argue. He just nodded a single broken motion. His eyes glistened, but not from anger, from something closer to surrender. After a moment, he whispered, I didn't mean to lie. I just wanted him to sound strong. I said, you made him sound perfect. That's not the same. He laughed once bitter. Guess perfection runs in the family. We stood there, two orphans, clinging to the same wound, both realizing it would never fully heal. When we went back inside, the technician was packing up. He handed me a flash drive. For the record, he said, there's one more file in the folder, labeled Legacy Message Final.move. Looks personal. I didn't open it. Not yet. Evan looked at me hesitant. Maybe he wanted us to find this together, he said. I nodded. Maybe that was the point. Before we left, I looked once more at the frozen frame of Dad's face on the monitor. The light flickered across his eyes, and for a heartbeat, I swore he blinked. In my head, his voice whispered the line he'd once told me while testing the mic. If anyone edits my words, they'll lose more than what I leave. They'll lose themselves. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow. The courthouse steps were slick, but the air felt lighter. Evan walked beside me, hands in his pockets. The truth didn't fix everything I said. He glanced at me. No. But it stopped the bleeding, for the first time that felt like enough. Outside the courthouse, snow was melting into thin ribbons along the windshield. Evan and I sat in his car, the engine off, our breaths fogging the glass. The world looked quiet again, as if it had run out of words, too. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Evan said softly, Do you ever think Dad wanted this to happen? I turned to him. You mean us fighting? He shrugged. No, I mean us listening. Maybe he knew it would take a mess to make us hear each other again. I laughed under my breath. Some lesson. Evan smiled faintly. He built things that lasted: tables, shelves, houses. Maybe he thought truth worked the same way. You build it, you sand it, you wait for it to hold. I watched the snow slide off the hood, small clumps dissolving into nothing. Maybe peace isn't found, I said quietly. Maybe it's built too. Evan nodded, hands in his pockets. I think he'd like that. A few minutes later, he started the car. The heater groaned to life, blowing warm air between us. Out the window, the courthouse steps gleamed under the fading light, wet and imperfect like everything Dad ever made. For once, that imperfection didn't bother me. It just felt honest. When I got home that night, the porch light was still on, burning like it had been waiting for someone who never arrived. Inside, everything smelled faintly of sawdust and time. Dad's tools hung neatly on the wall, a quiet museum of what once mattered. I turned on the small lamp beside his armchair. The chair creaked, settling like it remembered me. There was a folded newspaper on the side table, the date from a week before he passed. A headline about digital ethics stared back at me. I sat down and whispered, We're still learning, Dad, still trying to catch up to the truth. On impulse, I pulled my phone out and played the recovered file, his raw, coughing version of the will. The audio hissed, cracked, and trembled, but the imperfections hit harder than perfection ever could. When his voice said equally, I smiled. He'd meant more than inheritance. He meant forgiveness, too. The static at the end swelled and then broke into silence. And in that silence, I finally felt something I hadn't in months. Not relief, not grief, but belonging. Peace, I realized, wasn't an ending. It was the sound of something broken finding its shape again. The snow outside has started to melt. Drops slide down the window, catching the weak light of a pale morning. I'm back in Dad's house, surrounded by the quiet he left behind, his coat still on the hook, the clock still ticking, stubborn as ever. On the table sits the flash drive the technician gave me. One more file, Legacy Message Final.move. I've looked at it 100 times, never pressed play. Until now. The screen lights up. Dad sits in the dark, the lamp behind him buzzing faintly. His eyes are tired but steady. He speaks slowly, as if he's choosing each word from somewhere deeper than memory. If anyone edits my words, they'll lose more than what I leave. They'll lose themselves. He exhales, looks down, then back at the camera. But if you're watching this, it means I trusted you to hear me as I am. Don't clean the noise. Don't fix the cracks. That's where the truth breathes. The video ends. No fade out, no signature. Just static, soft, familiar, the sound that once filled our evenings. I don't cry this time. I just sit there, letting the noise wash through the room. It isn't harsh anymore. It's gentle, honest, alive. I hear you, Dad, I whisper. The words hang in the air, settle into the silence he left me. When the lawyer pressed play, I thought my father spoke from the grave. Now I know he never stopped speaking. I just had to listen past the silence. Some truths sound better unfinished, voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. If it were your father's voice, would you trust the recording? Tell me what you'd do. Sometimes the stories we share keep the truth alive. Weeks later, a small envelope arrived in the mail, no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note in block handwriting. You left something unfinished. The drive contained only one file, legacy message final 2.move. I hesitated for hours before pressing play. The screen stayed black for several seconds. Then Dad's voice came through, not steady, not rehearsed. Clara, he said softly, if you're hearing this, you already learned the truth. Don't waste it proving me right. Use it to remember me as wrong too. Then a faint laugh, almost embarrassed. Perfection's overrated. Leave something undone. That's where love hides. The screen went dark again. I sat there, hands trembling, realizing some echoes don't fade. They wait. And this time, I didn't save the file. I just listened and let it disappear. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to let me know. Share what truth sounds like in your own life, maybe a memory, maybe a voice you still hear when it's quiet. Your stories mean more than numbers here. Every comment, every word becomes part of the echo. If you'd like to walk with me through more stories like this, tales of family trust and the kind of love that never quite fades, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for being here and for keeping these echoes alive.